out with the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. I do believe this fits in nicely with the basic theme of political action and action of governments because, in a sense, everything I'm going to talk about in the few minutes I have would be on a political action for women by the United Nations, by governments, and by civil society. The paper will cover a historical background of the Fourth World Conference on Women. It will discuss the significance of the Fourth World Conference on Women, gains, gaps, and issues in the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action. Then I will go into some current critical areas of concern. These are areas that are getting a lot of attention now, more now than during the time of Beijing. And these are women in conflict, women in migration, natural disasters and climate change, and financing for gender equality. Finally, I will end my presentation by presenting a current campaign for gender equality and architecture reform in the UN, or the GEAR campaign. So by way of history, I think all of us are perfectly aware that we had, prior to Beijing, we had 3 UN World Conferences on Women in 1975 in Mexico, 1980 in Copenhagen, and 1985 in Nairobi. In 1990, there was no World Conference as expected, since they were having it every 5 years. But at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, at an extended session, they reviewed the implementation of the Nairobi forward-looking strategies that came out of the last World Conference. And this review revealed that there had been significant changes after Nairobi as countries tried to change their laws in order to conform to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. However, these changes tended to level off, as implementation of the laws were much more slow in coming. Thus, while there was progress in de jure equality, de facto equality was far behind. So the decision was there was need for drastic action. They decided to hold a 4th World Conference on Women in 1995. And the idea was this conference would focus on priority areas and strategic objectives to reach the goals of equality, development, and peace, and it would recommend specific actions. Thus, the theme, Action for Equality, Development, and Peace. What was the significance of the Beijing conference? First of all, Beijing built on the past 3 World Conferences on Women, and that's a pretty good foundation. It also built on and upheld commitments of major UN conferences of the decade. These were the Conference on Environment and Development in Rio in 1992, Human Rights in Vienna in 1993, Population and Development in Cairo in 1994, and Social Development in Copenhagen in 1995. The 4th World Conference on Women covered familiar ground and reinforced old concerns raised during the UN Decade on Women that remained valid and needed to be addressed. For example, problems of the feminization of poverty, economic participation, health, education, political participation, and human rights. But most important, the 4th World Conference on Women broke new ground in such areas as violence against women, elevating the issue from a private domestic concern to the level of public policy, and broadening the definition to include acts previously justified in the name of culture and tradition. Women's unremunerated work, acknowledging women's work, and calling for the development of methodologies for measuring it and reflecting it in national accounts. Women's rights as human rights, and women's sexual rights as part of her human rights. The rights of the girl child, addressing issues of discrimination and seeking protection from all forms of abuse and exploitation. And women migrant workers, as distinct from simply women migrants, recognizing them as a vulnerable group and ensuring their rights. The Fourth World Conference on Women also raised the level of awareness and discussion of gender issues globally. But perhaps the most special feature of the Fourth World Conference on Women, at least in my mind, is its consultative and participatory spirit. The preparations for Beijing involved complex consultation processes at the national, regional, and global levels, and the partnership between GOs and NGOs, while not without tension, were unparalleled. The Beijing process demystified the UN processes and procedures, and in the end, at the official conference in Beijing and the forum, NGO forum in Huairou, this was the largest UN conference ever. The 1990s were very exhilarating times for the United Nations as well as for civil society groups and advocates. As a fitting end to a decade full of promise, in September 2000, heads of state and government gathered at the United Nations headquarters in New York at the end of the millennium and at the dawn of a new one to reaffirm their commitment to the UN Charter and to a more peaceful, prosperous, and just world. The Millennium Declaration was the consensus of a global vision for improving the condition of humanity. Now let me go into the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action. I'd like to say that 5 years after Beijing, and then again 10 years after Beijing, the implementation of the platform was reviewed at the national, regional, and global levels. And at these two meetings, Beijing +5 and Beijing +10, countries, governments, reaffirmed commitment to the implementation of the 12 critical areas of concern of the platform, recognized gaps in implementation, and pledged action to ensure full and accelerated implementation. We have listed for your review the 12 critical areas of concern, which I won't read because of time constraints, but I hope are all familiar with these 12 areas, and if not, I'd like to remind you of these 12 very important areas. So, what happened after Beijing? Were the commitments in Beijing implemented? The reviews showed that we had reason to celebrate some gains. There were definite gains. For instance, national machineries were created in most countries, and these national machineries for women were mandated to facilitate the implementation of the platform. There were also, in most countries, gender plans, and in some, gender budgets. Violence against women was addressed through a wide range of interventions. Special bodies and units were established. There were new laws passed or old laws amended to make them less discriminatory. There were special courts and judicial processes to handle sex crimes. In the area of women and health, the rights-based framework was introduced and used, and improved data was also available in the area of reproductive health. Recognition and attention to HIV/AIDS was also a gain, and the expansion of health services. Over that decade after Beijing, there were a lot of conventions, resolutions, and human rights mechanisms that were passed, and they were tools for bringing pressure on government in the area of women's human rights. Also, I'd like to acknowledge breakthrough work on gender-sensitive indicators, gender analysis, and gender audits, making it easier and making monitoring and evaluation of the status of women much better. Also, gains in the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action was the transformation of women and their organizations. For instance, women were more confident after the Beijing process, and through the Beijing process, they were much more confident and aggressive. They tended to work in groups and networks rather than individually. Their women's groups,